I know we've probably got several people out this week visiting friends and family, and I expect we've got several people visiting with us today who are also here because you're visiting friends and family, so we want to welcome you. We've been doing a walk through the book of James on Sunday mornings. I'm going to be continuing that here this morning. I wanted to start with a story about a guy named Inigo Lopez de Recalde. So as I was walking to the sound booth this morning, Steve Foster pulled me aside and said, "We noticed something about one of your slides," which, sends me into an immediate panic, right? Like, what did I get wrong? And he said, "Well, we thought this was a picture of you." So maybe that's my doppelganger, I don't know. I'm not descended from Spaniards, but could be, who knows. Inigo was born in 1491. His parents were nobles, and they owned a castle in the northern part of Spain where he grew up. So, as you've already observed, he was a dashingly handsome young man, but very talented, and also known for being quite an arrogant guy. He was in the military. He became this very valiant soldier. He participated in many battles. He was known for his wild spirit and his womanizing. And in fact, when he was 26 years old, the Spanish and French armies were at war, and there was a particular battle where the Spanish army was conspicuously losing, and everyone wanted to give up except for Inigo. He was the one voice who spoke up to his commanding officer and said, "We can't give up, we can do this, we've got to push forward, we can't stop, we can't surrender." And basically, just by his sheer charisma and enthusiasm as a leader, the other soldiers rallied and they continued fighting. Now, unfortunately for Inigo, in this battle, they were firing cannonballs, the French were, and a cannonball shot it and went right between his legs, and on the way between his legs, it grazed one and injured that leg, and the other leg it completely shattered. So all of a sudden, all of his hopes for grandeur and guts and glory, all that went away, and he was confined to a sick bed for many, many months. All the fame was gone, and suddenly he went from being the center of everyone's attention to just having to be there by himself much of the time. It gave him a lot of opportunity to think about his life, and without much else to do, he read a lot of books. He started reading lots of different kinds of books, and ultimately he became a Christian. So as he was sitting around just observing his thoughts, he noticed that he felt different ways when he read different kinds of stories. Now, at first, the books he gravitated toward were more like action books. He liked to read books about knights and their adventures and their conquests, and he would read those and he would enjoy those. But then he noticed he happened to have a book that was full of stories about the life of Jesus. And he had another few books that were stories about the lives of some of the great Christian saints of the past, heroes of the Christian faith. And he started reading those books as well. And again, with much time to pay attention to himself and his thinking and his feelings, he noticed that depending on which kinds of stories he was reading, they affected him in different ways. Now, on the one hand, when he would read those stories about knights and adventurers, it'd get his blood pumping, it would get him excited, it would get his imagination turning, but then he'd get to the end of the book and he'd feel a little dry and a little empty and frankly just needed to find another one to read. It didn't leave him feeling full. But as he started reading stories about the lives of very dedicated Christians, humble people who did good, brave people who stepped out on faith, people who gave everything up for the sake of the gospel, and remember, this is a very wealthy young man, he got to the end of those stories and found that on the inside he felt much more full, and he felt inspired, and he felt a yearning for something greater and something higher. Now, Inigo was later known as Francis of Loyola. You can look him up. He became a great writer himself. But what he started noticing in his experience is what I believe that James is addressing in our text this morning. There are different kinds of wisdom in the world, and the wisdom that comes from God is different than the wisdom of the world. James will tell us worldly wisdom drives us to be more self-absorbed, self-aggrandizing, thinking about shallower things, but wisdom that comes from God invites us to higher thinking, more reflection on our purpose, feeling full, feeling meaningful. There's something different about wisdom whose true source is God. James says in chapter 3 and verse 13, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. That first question, if he were asking that here in this assembly, how could you answer it? Who are the really wise people here? I mean, you wouldn't raise your hand for that, right? You can't brag about being a humble person, right? There's certain things here you can't just own and claim for yourself. But I think as we'll see, wisdom has a way of making itself obvious. You can tell by the results of a person's choices. Not that everything always goes well in anyone's life, but as a result of consistent, wise choices built on godly wisdom, things begin to look a different way. I wanted to share with you my very favorite quote from the TV show The Office, Dwight Schrute and his wisdom. He says, "Whenever I'm about to do something, I think, would an idiot do that? And if they would, I do not do that thing." It's a pretty good life philosophy. But wisdom has a way of making itself evident. It reveals itself. It's not something that we have to brag about. It's something that people begin to see in us. Wisdom is a kind of self-evident thing. James says in chapter 4 and verse 1, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions." In this part of the text, we're showing that genuine tension between godly wisdom and worldly wisdom. Now, the world loves to claim that its wisdom is just as good as what God is offering. Everyone loves to say, well, sure, it's great that you're a Christian. I like that for you, but I can produce something just as good on my own. I've got so many other sources I can turn to for life and wisdom and meaning and fulfillment and happiness. That's just one of many paths. The world wants to make those claims, but if we start looking at the purveyors of worldly wisdom, they always end up bankrupt when you look at the results of what they produce. I want to talk about a few different purveyors of worldly wisdom. We have, for example, people who are double-tongued. James talked about this a lot last week, the problem of being a human being who is always the source of two different kinds of things. To where on the one hand, someone would want to say things that are kind and encouraging and nourishing, but then in the next breath would curse and condemn and insult and harm. So many people in the world would love to claim to be kind and peaceable and all these things, yet with their actions also are vile, vicious, unforgiving. Being double-tongued is one of the things we encounter in the world when we listen to worldly wisdom. We discover that it's not all the same thing all the time. One of the most common voices I think we hear in the world is the voice of cynicism, the voice of the cynic. I think very often, especially in internet culture, cynicism loves to masquerade as wisdom. I think it all goes back to Descartes, just this ability to sort of doubt absolutely everything except the fact that you're doubting. Everything is about deconstruction. You try to be a person who puts something out that's positive and wholesome that you feel good about, and someone's just determined to find some way to reveal its weakness, its Achilles heel, to pull the rug out from under your joy, to insult you somehow. Cynicism just loves to look for the worst in everything. Y'all remember Grumpy Cat, don't you? A few years ago, one of the older memes, but what an interesting trend and so accurate with how much of the world is. The problem with cynicism is that it's always looking for the worst in everything. And how can we ever hope to have a better, happier life when we are fixated with a laser-like focus only on things that irritate us that we don't approve of? It doesn't lead us to a better place. Slightly better than this would be the people who love to be fact quoters. Maybe you have some of these on your Facebook walls as well. Isn't it amazing how if you put on a lab coat and speak with a British accent and add enough footnotes to whatever you're writing, everyone assumes it must just be really smart. People love to just go and put out all kinds of information. A few years ago, the CEO of Google claimed that we are now making as much information every 2 days as used to exist from the dawn of time until about 2003. Think about that. About every 2 days, the amount of information going out is equal to everything from the dawn of time until about 2003. I don't know how in the world you would estimate that, but that's his estimate. But it is the case that we're rapidly putting out all kinds of information. But just because a person can quote facts at you, facts don't always lead us to greater wisdom. And frankly, sometimes it's hard to know what facts we can trust. Whose wisdom, whose science, whose opinions. My dad told me about an experience in graduate school where one of his major professors had conducted a large research experiment. He studied sociology. And so they conducted this big experiment, and the results kind of disproved his thesis. The thing that he was trying to prove, that wasn't what the results showed. So all he did was he adjusted his parameters to where it would agree with him. That happens all the time. People continue to say what they want to say and find ways simply to justify it. Fact quoting masquerades as wisdom. It isn't always true wisdom. And then there are some people who are just heavy negotiators. The people who think that might makes right. And whatever it is I have to do to get this thing accomplished, it doesn't matter who I hurt or how I treat anyone or what I do behind the scenes, as long as the result is the desired results, who can argue with the results? The truth is, the world can be a pretty nasty place, and lots of sources around us are trying to convince us that they have the key to life and happiness. But think about this. In this list we've been working through, behind every double-tongued person, behind every cynic, behind everyone who wants to just overwhelm you with information, behind everyone who would coerce you into the way that they think that you have to be, behind each of those, what you find when you unmask it is someone doing exactly the kinds of things that James is talking about. He says in chapter 3 and verse 14, "But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic." This next verse is interesting. "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." Is that true in your experience? When you find someone who is just absolutely driven to look out for number one, to get more, to have more, to be acknowledged, and where the only thing that's driving them is their ego, isn't it amazing how people will cut absolutely any corner in the world to get this thing that they think they have to have, this thing that they want? People want to function as if the world revolves around them. I start to want something bad enough, the reputation, success, sometimes revenge, and if I can't get it honestly and it's not happening quick enough, then I just start making compromises. Pride is a problem because pride would acknowledge that we have gifts and we have talents and we have resources given to us by God, but pride is only asking, how can I use those to my own advantage and for my own benefit? Even where you have giftedness, pride can undermine it. Bitter envy that he talks about, bitter envy is misguided zeal. Rather than looking at someone else and their blessings or their successes or their faithfulness, rather than looking to someone else for inspiration and encouragement, we look at them and begin to wonder how we could take that away from them somehow, or to be angered that they've received it and I have not. To me, this becomes especially important when we're tempted to criticize people in positions of leadership. Is the real reason I'm so mad about what they've done is that secretly I just wish I were in their shoes, and I wish people would see me differently. We don't always operate from a fair, even-handed mindset when we're offering criticism. Why am I so determined to see another person's failures and shortcomings? James says that everything about these ways of living just reeks of jealousy and ambition. And he says ultimately these things are demonic. Invites the spiritual realm into all of this. That our attitudes, our anger, our ambition, that these are all not just worldly matters, but deeply spiritual matters. These things can be demonic if left unchecked. He even brings up that interesting test case about the problem of unanswered prayers as people might perceive it. Why doesn't God answer my prayers? He says, well, some things you don't have because you don't ask, and then other things you do ask for but you don't receive because the only reason you're praying right now is to look out for number one. You're not praying for God's purposes. You're not spending time with God to think about your own role and God's vision for your life. You're simply praying because you want to treat God like some sort of a vending machine who's just supposed to give you everything that you want. And it's still all about you and the world revolving around you. Now, we can become, even as Christians, we can become very blind to just how much this can affect us. There was a Dear Amy column I saw on Facebook a few years ago. It's a little lengthy, but I want to read it to you because I think this really illustrates well the problem with how blind we can get to when we come under the influence of this kind of thinking. This lady writes a letter to Amy and says, "Dear Amy, every fall, several of my female relatives have a weekend shopping excursion in our home city." Maybe some of y'all have done that this weekend. "We stay in a hotel, treat ourselves, shop for our children, and go out for lunches and dinners. It's a great time to reconnect. I have a sister, Wendy, whom we do not invite. She is offended to the point of tears when she finds out we have not invited her. Wendy is close to our age, but we don't have as much in common. See, we're all married, stay-at-home moms. Wendy is a divorced working mom with one young child. There are several reasons we do not include her. We know she doesn't have very much money for such an outing. She also does not have many of the same interests as we do. See, we're very active churchgoers. She only attends services sporadically. Plain and simple, she just doesn't fit in with us. Now, she takes it really personally, and last year even came over to my home unannounced, crying about it, and it upset my children and caused my husband to have to threaten to call the police if she wouldn't leave. Now she barely speaks to me and has told our relatives that I'm a horrible person, even though I've helped her out sometimes. How can we get her to understand that she should perhaps find another set of friends whose lives and interests align more closely with hers?" Signed, Sad Sister. Sit with that one for a second. So here's the response. "Dear Sad, first, let's establish that I agree with your sister. You are a horrible person. Obviously, you can do whatever you want and associate with or exclude whomever you want, but you don't get to do this and also blame the person you're excluding for not fitting in. The only way your sister would ever fit in would be for you to make room for her. You are unwilling to do that, and that is your choice. But being upset is completely justified, and you'll just have to live with that. Perhaps this is something you could ponder from your church pew, because despite your regular attendance, you don't seem to have learned very much." Right? Signed, Amy. But that's the tension, right? We want to say, as long as I check these boxes and follow the right steps and come across a certain way and look a certain way, then I've just got it made, and therefore I am what I'm claiming to be. And stories like that remind us that there's also a lot going on under the surface. Because even if we claim that we want to follow God, if we're not letting go of the worldly way of thinking, we end up in what I think are truly some demonic-looking behaviors. We can become so blind to how we are sometimes. I think James offers some insights into how we sort out our motives. If we're in the middle of a tough decision, if you've got a dilemma in your life, you're struggling with a relationship in your life, we do really want to ask that question about, am I really doing things the way that Jesus would do things? James chapter 3 and verse 17 says, if you want to find heavenly wisdom, it looks like this. It says, "Wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." I really love the last part of that verse. A harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. How do I know if what I'm doing is something that God would be proud of, something that God would want me to do? How do I know if I'm listening to the real best sources of advice? Several questions we could ask drawing off of this text. One question would be, is this choice that I'm making, is it helping me to be more pure? Heavenly wisdom is not going to further fragment your life. Heavenly wisdom is going to make you feel more whole. There will be greater consistency in the different areas of your life and the different ways you deal with things. Wisdom from God will not fragment you. Wisdom from God will heal you and make you whole. For it to be pure, it's not mixed with anything else. It's not diluted. It is characteristically unhypocritical. It's unhypocritical. We might ask questions about our choices and say, this thing I'm about to do or this thing I'm persisting in, would I feel good about my child watching me do it? Would I feel good about explaining to my child the reasons why I made this decision and this choice? We don't need to live in ways that are lopsided and unbalanced. We want to be the same in every situation. Is this helping me be more pure in all aspects of my life? Is this choice making me more of an honest person? Am I being real about things? Not talking about just oversharing, but really operating from a place of truth, open to reason, being part of a culture that doesn't frown on hard questions or thoughtfulness. We want to strive to live in a way that there aren't a bunch of different versions of ourselves in every setting, but that we could be the same thing throughout. And people can always come to know us as we are because we live in such a way that we are about one thing. There's also the very important question about peacefulness. If there's any way to be identified as one of the children of God, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers because they're going to be called sons of God. It's how you identify Jesus' people because peace happens when they're around. Wisdom calls us to greater peace. Peace internally with the way that we are, and then also peace externally in the way that we interact with people. Now, James is writing in a context of revolution. Very, very heated disputes between the Jewish people and the Roman government, and this is a time where zealots would be pushing back on any kind of peaceful talk like that. Your political enemy makes a mistake, you shout it, you exploit it, you draw attention to it, you escalate, and you try and rally people to your cause. You can't show any kind of weakness by being peace-minded. But he said wisdom that comes from above is peaceful. When Scripture imagines peace, I don't know what you think of when you think of peace, but so often in the world we settle for too shallow of a definition. And we might talk about a time of peace, and all that we really mean is we've agreed to stop shooting rockets at each other, us and some other nation. Peace is just kind of the halt of aggression. But when Scripture imagines peace, it's talking about the lion and the lamb taking a nap together. It's talking about everything in the world really being as it should be. That we are healed from our infirmities, that we are healed from the effects of sin in our lives, that we can go to sleep at night without our consciences burdened with guilt and worries. The peace that we're ultimately yearning for in Christ means that everything will be in its right place. And until that ultimate fulfillment of peace, that is the way that we try to operate, that we want things to be in their right place. We want to function in the way that God has called us to function. And he says all of this leads us, again, I love that verse, to a harvest of righteousness. That's a nice thing to think about in your life, isn't it? If you persisted in things that are difficult for you, if you continued trying to be a person of great integrity, even if no one else around you is, and you persist in doing the right thing, isn't it a nice thought that eventually what you see produced in your life is that you do have a harvest of righteous things. You have many things to be proud of, many things to feel good about, sincere relationships built on things that are healthy and God-honoring, a harvest of righteousness. That could take so many good directions, but that is what we're longing for. We want to be people who do the right things in the right ways for the right reasons. As you think about your own life this morning, maybe there's just some things you're reflecting on that you want to be praying about silently as we prepare to sing this song of encouragement. Maybe there's something in your life that you're really struggling to sort out, and you'd like the church to pray that God would help you with wisdom from above. That's one of the great promises in the book of James, that if we need wisdom, we should ask God, because God gives generously to those who seek his wisdom. Maybe there's a decision you need to make. If there's anything that we could do to assist you this morning, this is a time we've set aside for that. We'd invite you to talk to us while together we stand and sing this song.